So these different forms of attention are just one parts of the mental processing that we refer to as knowing or awareness. These are all concepts that are necessary for the capacity to use language, which is the main interest, of course, for speech therapists. You'll hear a lot of terms regarding the use of cognitive processing in everyday conversation: remembering, understanding, judging, reasoning. These are all very much lay terms. These are terms that are used in the general population to have meaning that is routine and not difficult to appreciate. But psychologists attempt to make these terms much more scientifically valid by looking for explanations about how these processes may be instantiated in the mental apparatus and also in the brain. So when we talk about words like attention, remembering, knowing in a very common sense way, we refer to that as folk psychology, F-O-L-K. So, everybody has an opinion about what those things are. In other words, everybody's a psychologist when we think about psychological processes at the level of folk psychology. But when we look at the neurology of these processes, we're trying to get a better, more detailed, verifiable view of what these processes are. But then on the other hand, having said that, it's difficult often to draw a distinction between the layperson's definition of what attention is and the scientific construct that is being explained by the cognitive neuroscientist. So the cognitive neuroscientist is trying to study attention at a deeper level than the simple folk idea of attention. But that's often not appreciated in the field of psychology. So the attentional system, although we call it the attentional system, doesn't have to be called attention. It could be called something else, referring to processes that attention manifests itself as. But the level of explanation that we're trying to attain with neurology is a more brain-based level, which we think is much more scientific, really. So I'd like to also just talk a little bit at this point about cultural differences, which is one of the things that is not often appreciated in studies of psychology or cognitive neuroscience or indeed neurology. There is this idea that in different cultures the terms attention might have subtle changes in meaning. So we're very much in the English-speaking world locked into the use of terms that we use for everyday conversation and are understandable by anyone as folk psychology. But the same terms may have quite a different meaning in other cultures. So attention might not have a similar translation in Chinese. And that makes it very confusing to study the processes that are needed in attentional engagement across different cultures. The best way to illustrate this, I think, is to go back to a very famous philosopher whose name was Wittgenstein. And Wittgenstein wrote a classic piece of philosophical theorizing, which is argued that actually all humans are trapped in language. So science is not possible because our constructs are always going to retard us in our understanding of the laws of physics and science and biology. So the question raised is, can we ever really study the brain as humans? Because the only way we have of explaining the brain is through the use of folk terms, language. But language itself is an arbitrary construct. It doesn't carry any real meaning. And why do we know that? Because the same construct or concept can have a completely different sense in another culture. There is this idea that people who are Western educated, come from a Western culture, think a little differently to people from an Asian culture or Eastern culture. For example, one common idea is that thinking, cognitive processing in Asian culture is more collective, more group-oriented, so that cognition might be more than just what happens inside one person's brain, whereas in the case of Westerners, we have much more individualistic view. One brain, one mind, one behavior. So this is one example of the differences across cultures that you can observe quite easily when you live in Hong Kong, because you can see the differences between the more traditional Western and the more familiar local Eastern ways of thinking about folk psychology. I guess the other thing that is perhaps a little stereotypical, but Westerners tend to think very much in a straight line. So there's a tendency in Western philosophy and Western psychology, therefore, to think about things in a very linear pattern, as though one thing leads to another. But of course in Asian cultures, it's often that thinking occurs in a circle. Things don't necessarily go in a straight line. There might be a kind of spiral process to thinking. So this is not helpful in that, because all of the psychology, neurology, cognitive neuroscience that we engage in the West is very linear, where we think step one in cognition is followed by step 2, etc. Maybe that's not a very helpful construct to understand the mind or the brain. So there's another example of some differences. We're also, I think, in the West very inclined to focus on free will. We take for granted that cognition is under our own volition, that we are able to exercise volition and free will over our reasoning, judgment, decision-making, etc., allocation of attention. But in the Eastern cultures, that's not the case. There's much less focus on free will and much more on determinism, fate, that we have actually very little control over our fate. This is more of a deterministic view, so that the overriding principle in Asia, well, not all of Asia, but let's say where we live, is traditionally on harmony and the tendency to exercise self-control. And in Australia or London, the opposite is true, where actually chaos and disruption are a part of our upbringing. So there's different senses of what folk psychology might be in different cultures. So one question becomes, how do we approach the topic of neurological function in different cultures? Do we approach it with language that is more neutral? Or do we approach it with language that's familiar to one culture but maybe not familiar to another? How much do our underlying cultural mores dictate the way that we carve up nature and see nature? Western people have a very strong tendency to categorize. They like to put things into different boxes, A, B, C. They like to show that there are differences between certain phenomena. But in the case of the West, there's not such a tendency to categorize or typologize. It's not necessarily the case that wisdom is found from categorizing nature into more and more different layers or categories. There's much more of this idea of things being interconnected rather than separated. So I think this is important to notice, because it might be that in order for us to really understand the brain and how neurology of cognition works, we need to focus more perhaps on more on a neutral level of discourse, of interpretation. Maybe we need a mathematics of the brain so that we don't get bogged down in the folk psychology of labels that are used in the West and misapplied to the minds of the Eastern world. If we have different symbols that are not found in culture to discuss processes like attention, then that might give us a better view in the longer term of the cognitive neuroscience of cognition.